Welcome back, everybody, to the second session of this conference as a partnership between the Europe Stories project at Oxford University and the House of European History, where we are today. It's great to see so many of you here and also online. I'm not going to repeat the whole big introduction to the project, but just to say we're now moving on to look at the subjects of democracy and freedom in the EU as core values of the EU, as things that young Europeans particularly care about, and then how that relates to the terrible war in Ukraine and how what's happening in Ukraine changes the way we think about the future of the EU. To introduce this, we have three great speakers. Two of them are members of our original Oxford team, current or former graduate students at Oxford. Sophie Vériter, on my right, was our MPhil student, is now a doctoral researcher and lecturer at Leiden University. Jan Farfal, I'm glad to say, is still our doctoral student in Russian and East European studies. Sophie will talk about democracy. Jan will talk about freedom in the context of foreign external policy. I'm particularly thrilled to welcome Liliia Antoniuk from the University of Kyiv. She's doing a doctorate at Kyiv, which has been obviously interrupted by the war. So she is at the moment with her family, the female members of her family, in Spain. But we're just delighted to have you with us to talk about the Ukrainian perspective. So without more ado, each of our speakers will give about 7 minutes introduction, and then we'll go straight into a conversation. Sophie, democracy.
Thank you. Yes, democracy. So we wrote a very interesting report, which you can access online at europeanmoments.com, and also here some copies are available. And together with my colleague Joseph, we wrote a chapter on democracy. And one of the findings we had was that actually not everybody understands what democracy really means, or at least not everybody understands it the same way. So I thought I would start by having a common understanding of what democracy is. If you didn't know already, democracy comes from Greek. It means power to the people. So it's a form of government that makes sure that people decide what's going on, whether that's directly, for instance, via a referendum, or through representatives that are elected and that represents your interests and opinion. It's a spectrum rather than a black or white situation. So you have various types and models of democracy in Europe and throughout the world. And in the EU, it works by having some checks and balances between the different institutions and actors. So you have some institutions that have members directly elected, like the European Parliament. You have some that are appointed, such as in the Commission, and some that are directly the same leaders that are elected in their own countries in the member states. So that's, for instance, the Council. Now that we have this common ground, I thought of mentioning and talking about four main challenges that we have observed going on in Europe when it comes to democracy. The first one is a sense of losing trust in the EU to protect democracy. We looked at some data from the Eurobarometer that showed how many people associate with the EU with democracy. And there was an upward trend up until 2018, and then all of a sudden that has decreased since then. So there is a sense among young Europeans specifically that the EU doesn't symbolize democracy as much as it did before. Also, a very interesting polling we did revealed that 53% of young Europeans think authoritarian states are better equipped than democracies to tackle the climate crisis. So there is also a sense that democracies are perhaps not as effective than other regimes to tackle urgent challenges that we're facing. The second challenges that we talk about in this report is that the majority of young Europeans believe that the EU should act more decisively to uphold liberal democratic institutions, such as independent courts and media. we have all seen or heard about what's going on in Hungary and in Poland. And in our report, when we wrote it, we were calling for a lot more action. And since then, a couple of developments have taken place, but it's not yet sure what's going to happen in the end. So there is still a lot of work to be done. The third challenge that we mentioned in our chapter on democracy was that, yes, young Europeans are overall satisfied with democracy. 57% say that they are satisfied with democracy in Europe. However, their knowledge of democracy is not always the same. Nearly 1 in 2 young Europeans do not know that the members of the European Parliament are directly elected by citizens each year. So they are critical, but at the same time not so aware. And then 1 in 5 respondents in our survey correctly identified the person who gives the EU State of the Union address. Who knows who gives the State of the Union address here in the room? State of the Union? Yes? Yes? Yes, okay, President of the Commission, correct. Well, only 1 in 5 respondents could say that correctly. So how can we explain that young Europeans highly value democracy, are highly critical, but at the same time, they don't understand or they don't engage so much with democratic processes? Because 58% of young Europeans do not vote in European Parliament elections. So how can we explain that? We believe that young Europeans understand democracy not as a set of political processes, not as procedures, but more as a set of values that they wish to see the EU protect and uphold in Europe and elsewhere. So this brings me to the 4th main challenge that we have observed, which is that voting is the primary means of political expression, but yes, young Europeans do not vote for MEPs, and also, I'm pretty sure the results are similar in other cases at the national level. Also, our polling revealed that most young Europeans believe that the presence of the European Parliament is of secondary importance to deliver effective actions. And they do not believe that their preferences are best communicated by voting, right? So the apparent disinterest or lack of knowledge, we believe, is because the processes of democracy are not so adapted, are not so appealing anymore to young peoples in today's society. So 3 key points that we propose to do to kind of like address that mismatch is that democracy should be more deliberative, direct, and involving more ordinary people as representatives. To rethink the way the EU engages with its young citizens. So more opportunities for citizens' initiative. There is, of course, an existing citizens' initiative, but it requires 1 million signature. I think there could be more ways of involving young citizens. There is also this idea of having transnational lists for the European Parliament that's now being discussed, and there was a proposal approved recently. Also harmonizing, perhaps, electoral conditions for the European Parliament. A second important point that we suggested was to have initiatives that are made by young people for young people. And so there was this idea of a conference on the future of Europe. Has anyone heard of the Conference on the Future of Europe? A little bit. Has anyone participated in it? Not so much. Yes, a little bit?
Hands up. Who's actually participated? 3.
3 people, right. We were extremely critical of the Conference on the Future of Europe within the team and specifically within that chapter, because it was sold as a real initiative that was bottom-up, but actually it was very bureaucratic and it was very top-down, and it wasn't fun and it wasn't made by young people for young people. So yes, there is a missed opportunity there, but there is also a chance to do it better next time. To have that really be truly bottom-up, to have civil society organizations involved and at the center stage of organizing this Conference on the Future of Europe. And the last point that we suggest to address is to have more pan-European initiatives that promote a European public sphere, right? Because nowadays we have public spheres that develop at the transnational level, right? We are all interested in what's going on in the presidential elections in Europe, in France, in Germany, whether we are French or German or not. So there is this sense of debate at the European level, right? But the authority and the elections are still happening at the national level. So we want to promote more of that European public sphere. We want to see more efforts to support independent media, more education about how the EU is actually working. We could make Europe Day a public holiday, right, tomorrow. I think everyone would be happy to have Monday off. More Erasmus. Erasmus has been one of the most successful programs of the EU, and one of our project finding is that, yes, people believe that the EU wouldn't be worth having without freedom of movement. And in that sense, in the report, Joseph and I proposed that an Interrail pass is given to every EU citizen at the age of 16, available for 5 years, because that would promote having more of that exchange, having more of that travel, and having more of that European public sphere. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That was great. We'll pick up a couple of points from that. I'd love to hear in the discussion what people think of the outcome of the Conference on the Future of Europe and whether it's actually got there to some interesting recommendations. The other point we'll pick up on is the reference to Poland and Hungary. What is the impact of the Ukraine war on the EU's conditionality on rule of law and democracy in these countries? Is it in fact going to be the case that the EU is going to go soft on Poland, for example, because Poland has been so much in the front line in response to the Ukraine war, both in terms of welcoming refugees, but also in terms of military and diplomatic support? So that might be something for both Jan and Liliia to think about. Jan, over to you.
So I'm going to relate to the final chapter of our report related to Europe in the world, or to borrow a phrase of Stefan Lehne's phrase, Europe as a besieged island in the sea of geopolitics. So essentially the main argument within the chapter was to move towards Europe's strategic autonomy. And I would like to reflect on the three main points from the report. The first one being the European mandate for greater European resilience and activity on the global stage. Then on the promise of a geopolitical commission, as stated by Ursula von der Leyen, and the state of affairs, whether those promises have been met or not. And the third aspect, which is a crux within this road towards global Europe, namely the young Europeans' reluctance towards the traditional understanding of power politics. And consequently, the question emerges, how do we reconcile those three issues within Europe's strategic autonomy? But let's start with the mandate for a more active sphere of European politics within the global arena. So roughly 80% of Europeans, regardless of age, support the notion that Europe should take a more active stand in a global politics. Over the 30 years, we've seen a constant support for a more coherent European policy, also regardless of age, with roughly 60% of Europeans wanting the European foreign policy to be more coherent, rather than divided through the interests of member states. And what is more, young Europeans tend to be way more enthusiastic towards an idea of further enlargement. And this notion is very relevant when we think about Western Balkans or the recent developments in the Ukraine, and as we discussed it during our first panel, the question of Ukraine's accession. So moving to the second point on the promise of geopolitical commission, I think that we could all agree that the performance of this geopolitical commission can lead to mixed results over the last few years. But there came the recent developments, namely the war in the Ukraine and the way that the European Union reacted to it. There is this argument made by Alexander Stubb that it took Europe 4 years to address the financial crisis and to create a European stability mechanism. It took Europe only 4 months to prepare the European Recovery Fund for COVID, and it took only 4 days to prepare a historical package of sanctions against Russia. And however plausible this argument may be, it remains a question whether this growing resilience of European Union and the growing autonomy of action and also the timing of those actions can be translated into the broader sphere within the global politics. Yes, we had the strategic compass, but yes, we still have, for example, divisions on the question of Russian oil embargo. So those are the things that need to be observed in the future. So on the one hand side, we have a mandate of Europeans for this more active policy of Europe within the global stage, but then how do we perceive this mandate? Like, how do we translate it into a legitimate action? And I guess this refers to the question of democracy. To whom do we address this preference of Europeans and young Europeans in particular to have a more active stance in global politics? Then we have a promise of geopolitics, of a geopolitical commission made by the commissioner, president of the commission. And then there comes the crux. Young Europeans are reluctant towards the notion of traditional global power politics. Our internal pollings and interviews that we conducted for the project suggest that young Europeans are very eerie when it comes to the notion of Europe as a superpower. So we can make a test. If you agree that Europe should become a superpower, please raise your hand. Okay. I think the sentiment is reflected on the sphere where the younger generation did not raise their hands, whereas members of the older.
But maybe if you now ask civilians.
I will get to this. So how do we reconcile those three issues? So mandate for global action, geopolitical commission, and reluctance to traditional power politics. If we look, for example, on the sentiment of values represented of European Union and the way that young Europeans perceive those values, enhancing foreign security or defensive mechanism are not in the top 5 priorities. So the top 5 priorities for young Europeans are climate, education, tackling poverty. Then we have employment, promotion of human rights, then health, and only on the 7th position we have enhancing European security and defense capacity. Yes, those data come from 2019, and Ukraine clearly has played some role in changing those sentiments. But as I said before, it remains to be seen whether this sentiment is only channeled towards the enthusiastic support of Ukraine, or whether it will be translated towards a general notion of having active global Europe. So our idea was to focus on those values of promotion of human rights, climate change, democracy, and other values which are the cornerstone of European Union, and translate them into the external dimension. And we propose a term of Europe being a global green civilian superpower, and I guess you will have to wait a bit longer for the recommendations section to see what do we mean by this. Thank you.
Fantastic. Can I do a quick poll? So a few of us put up our hands when we said superpower. Now, who would support the idea of the EU being a green civilian superpower? Please put up your hands. You see, there you are. Almost unanimity, so that it illustrates this point. Liliia.
So, thank you, Timothy. And actually, now it is a great pleasure to participate in this particular discussion on Europe as democratic and free. We've discussed a bit values in this panel and the previous panel, but actually, before I will also check my data and figures, I would like to ask you, Timothy, how are you?
I'm fine.
Fantastic. And how are you, Sophie?
Yes, I'm good. Thank you.
Good. How are you?
Well, relieved I just finished my part. So.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. I'll come back to it a bit later. But as a young European ambassador in Ukraine national coordinator, I manage the work of 100 young people. And since the 24th of February, daily I've been sending them emails or messages, and the words which come after hello is actually, how are you? At the moment, right at this moment, this particular moment, there is a young European ambassador, a girl, who is based in Kharkiv. And I do believe that majority of you, by this moment, know where Kharkiv is based, is located. Just a week ago, there was a girl, a young European ambassador, who was based in Kherson. And I do believe that Kherson is not a new word for you now. 2 weeks ago, there was a boy who was based, young European ambassador again, who was based in Mykolaiv, and he managed to evacuate from Mykolaiv. And when I sent them this question, hello, how are you? By the day, it's 2 months, more than 2 months already. So their answers are a bit longer than yours. Of course, the first word is usually fine, but after that, without any additional questions, they put it like this. Hi, I'm fine. There was a missile attack in my district, so the local market was destroyed. We didn't have electricity for half a day. A few people were dead, but I'm fine, my family is fine, and how are you? So this is the answer which they give me. So for majority of Ukrainians, the question, how are you, is actually not a question of being fine or not being fine. It's a question which equals to, are you still alive? It's a question like, do you still live in free and democratic Ukraine? Well, when we talk about Ukraine now, we are not talking about just the country. War is an every question. And the question, how are you for Ukrainian, is the question about how the war has impacted you and your country. But now actually going to Europe, being democratic and free. I like putting questions, so what is the price for democracy? Or what is the price of freedom? In particular, what is the price that young people, young Europeans, have to pay for democracy and freedom? Some time ago, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine has shared a story from one of the deliberated cities of Ukraine. The story is the following. Russians killed a young mother, a woman, and they tied her child, a baby child, to her dead body and put a bomb between them. So when there was an attempt to liberate the child, the bomb exploded. So what is the price of democracy and what is the price of freedom when we see the dead body of a mother, a child who was alive at that moment, and the bomb in between hidden so that nobody can see it. And it explodes at the moment when somebody tries to liberate the child. What is the price of democracy? What is the price of freedom for Europe, for other nations, for the world now, at this particular moment? Actually, when we talk about the European Union and the idea which stands actually behind it, so initially it was created purely on economic and some kind of money issues. But with the time, it has transformed. It became a soft power. Democracy and human rights, freedoms, like these are core values. In order to somehow, be this soft power, the European Union created the European Neighbourhood policy. And one of the aims of this policy is actually to bring peace and security and stability to the whole region. So again, the question here is, can there be stability and peace in Europe if the neighboring country, it is not only suffering, there is the threat that it will not exist anymore. This is not the country which is somewhere far away. The border of the European Union, just the border, the line, the war is on the border. So what is the price of democracy, and what is democracy for Europe and the European Union in particular? Actually, Charles Michel, when he came to Kyiv the previous month, he tweeted, you can check this tweet on his Twitter, in Kyiv, in the heart of free and democratic Europe. That's not my words. And Zelensky, the President Volodymyr Zelensky, at his statement to the Parliament of Portugal, made quite recently, also claimed the following: free people should support free people. Decent people should support decent people. Noble people should support noble people. So the question is the following: I do believe that you will not betray us and you will not betray yourself, but do you believe in that? So that is the question. Will you betray yourself, your European values, democracy, value of human rights, value of freedom, and so on and so on? There is a great quote which was made not by Zelensky, not by me, and actually I don't know who made that quote, but hell will open when the evil of this world exceeds our belief that it can be defeated. So what is the problem now? Is it the fear? But Ukrainians are not the one who has the fear. They are defending Europe and defending our common shared European values. And why I say this? Because, as I mentioned previously, 91% of Ukrainians do support accession to the European Union, which means that for Ukrainians, European Union is something of highest priority. I know that I'm a bit emotional because I was not the part of the project. I didn't see the numbers. I'm just the person from Ukraine and who is now managing the other young people who've been suffering from all this period. I just want to complete with the following, that there's also the notion that if you stand for the peace in Europe, you should stand for the peace in European neighborhood. And if you want to have this peace, you should act. And by active, it means that you should also think about your common security and defense policy. Unfortunately, it is not possible to defend yourself and to save your lives and our lives only with the olive branches. And we need to understand that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Liliia, for a really amazingly powerful statement. I think none of us, when we finished this project in 2021, the first phase of this project, could conceive of the idea that there would be a major land war in Europe and we would be hearing horrifying stories like the one you just told us. So that's extremely powerful. And also very powerful is the way you did in that presentation what President Zelensky did when talking to the European Parliament just up the road. If you remember, Zelensky said to the European Parliament, "Prove that you are indeed Europeans." So he turned it round 180 degrees. I have a quick question for you, which is Zelensky, after every meeting with the European leader, has been mentioning three things: weapons, sanctions, and EU membership. Just say in your own words, why is EU membership so important next to those two immediate things?
This is actually the question of survival for Ukraine. And when we talk about why European Union is important for Ukrainians, that's because from the very beginning, when Ukraine got its independence in 1991, there were already talks about the European Union. So it was not the issue which just appeared when 2004 or 2014. Since 1991, there were already some discussions regarding that. So these considerations and discussions and the issue of common shared values, this is something which is in our blood. So that's why, especially now, when you clearly see the difference between these values and Russia, and the ideology which is promoted by Russia and Russian occupants, there is no other choice, there is no other options. Ukraine is clearly a European state. It is defending the European common shared values, so there is no other way. If Ukraine will fail, all Europe will fail. And it is important to understand that.
Thank you very much. By the way, Chris Patton told me that his first conversation when he became a European Commissioner, and I think it's 1999, was with the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, who said, when are we going to become a candidate for EU membership? 1999. I mean, it's been a long time. Sophie, Jan, would you like to respond at all to anything that's been said so far, or should we go straight to the audience?
I can add something to what Liliia said, because I feel like for a lot of people, this crisis in Ukraine has just begun, but actually it's a war that has been already going on for many, many years. And back in 2014, 2015, I was lucky enough to travel to Ukraine and to become aware of what was going on there. And if you did not know, there was already crisis at that moment. And the Ukrainian people answered with so much power and so much strength among young people to become part of the EU, to have this cry that we want to be part of this family. And people were literally dying on the streets to become part of that European project. And from my perspective, becoming aware of that, coming from a place where we all took European membership, European values for granted, was really, really heartbreaking, because I was feeling like we were not taking advantage of this. We were not fighting for this, whereas there were people who were literally dying for this. And that was my formative moment, by the way. If you want to share your formative moment, we have a booth right there where you can share your own experience of Europe. So feel free to do so.
Yes, well, thank you for this powerful statement. And it's clearly true that while we are sitting here comfortably in Brussels, in Ukraine, people are conducting a life and death struggle for their independence and for the universal values, not only European, but like general values where you have a right for self-determination and to have your country. But I just want to relate back to what we said during the first panel and the way that European Union, the citizens of the European Union perceive the war in Ukraine, and whether this can become a formative moment. Because while we were conducting the research for the project, we concluded that it might be a Zoom generation. So COVID might become this defining moment for our generation. And yet now we witness this full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. So one of the main arguments that we had of trying to define young Europeans was that this is a generation which has not seen Europe divided or Europe at war. And suddenly this war returned to us in a scale unimaginable just a few months ago, as you, Timothy, stated. So there are a lot of open questions. How will we process now this notion? And there was this very interesting suggestion made at the EWM conference in Vienna that actually maybe young Europeans were the last generation, the third generation in a row which didn't see war in Europe happening, and whether we could reverse this, and just leaves us with a lot of open questions.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something we'd like to get at, actually, because we did 4 waves of opinion polling for this project. Already we're continuing with that, so it'd be good to try and get at simply empirically at the question whether it is a formative moment. Time for questions and comments. Those online, if you put your comments on YouTube, they'll reach me through my phone. There's a microphone here. Who would like to ask a question or make a comment from the floor? Don't hold back. Yes, Laura.
Thanks for the panel. Thanks especially for coming. And well, it's just a general comment. So Professor Garton Ash mentioned that in 2021, no one in this project would expect this to happen. I would argue further than saying one day before the invasion, 23rd of February, lots of people were not expecting it. I talked with some friends, and I think loads and loads of Europeans were not even imagining this happening. And so I started like questioning myself, like maybe we could look at Europe in a different way and asking why aren't we always like fighting each other? Instead of why do we have this peaceful state, why isn't war the normal state of affairs? Because for our generation it's not, but maybe for the generation before it was the normal state of affairs. And so I just like to leave this comment for discussion and to ask if you think this will change from now on.
It's a brilliant comment. That is to say, what for our young Europeans, the post-1989 generation, seems like normality is, historically speaking, profoundly abnormal. It's an absolutely exceptional condition in historical perspective. Would any of you like to respond on that, comment on that? Liliia.
Actually, first of all, I would like to thank you for putting it in the right way. It is a war. We are now living at war, and Europe is now living at war. And I do believe that this situation will be a formative moment for many Europeans, especially young Europeans. Because as I manage the Young European Ambassadors Network in Ukraine, I have colleagues who are managing the same branch, but in the EU member states. So we have around 90 young people, young Europeans, European Union citizens, who are actually the members of the network and who share their life experience, who share their thoughts with us. And indeed, we do understand that now the situation in Ukraine has impacted them greatly. The war in Ukraine has changed their perception of, what was granted to them, the values, the freedoms, what can be just taken in a second when the missile attack is at your home, at your house, and you're like, you're dead. So it can be changed just in a moment, in a second. So at least those young Europeans, European citizens who are following the situation, I do believe that for them this will be the moment.
Jan, did you want to?
Yeah, I can jump in as well. I just wanted to clarify perhaps to some of our online viewers that while talking about young Europeans not experiencing war, we are fully aware that there are parts of Europe which witnessed the war. Yugoslavia might be the first example, and even there are still parts of EU member states such as Croatia which can relate as a younger generation to the atrocities of war. Yeah. But I think that this question of war is of a fundamental importance while talking about Europe as as a green civilian superpower, because we finished the work on the report a year ago, and we already can ask some questions. How can you actually be a civilian superpower on a world stage? How can you compete with your rivals or competitors in a civilian terms rather than traditional old-fashioned way of power politics? So how can you be civilian in the wake of actual brutal force happening as we're seeing today in Ukraine?
So that's a great question, and I hope people will come back to it, because we can say, does the EU actually need to become a hard power and not just economic power and soft power? At the moment, there's a complexity around this discussion, because we're seeing NATO and EU coming ever closer. So it's almost as if the hard power stuff is outsourced to NATO. Gianpaolo, did you want to come in there? While the microphone is coming, Gianpaolo Arcado, for those who don't know, is the editor-in-chief of a superb online resource, Vox Europe, which is a contribution to creating the European public sphere. So it's publishing articles in a number of different European languages. Gianpaolo.
Thank you, Timothy.
I think it's working if you hold it close, yeah.
Sorry. Thank you, Timothy. And yes, we're focusing currently on Central and Eastern Europe more and more for obvious reasons. So my question would be, accession to the EU is a long and sometimes cumbersome process. it's very appropriate that the Ukraine has applied for it, but there is no real fast track for that, as other countries are experiencing currently, especially in southeastern Europe. So will Ukrainians be patient enough to wait for this process to come to an end? It might take years, and we have seen currently then the facts and news are pretty faster than the EU processes. So the question is, will Ukrainians be patient enough for that?
Thank you very much. Liliia, are you ready for the long haul?
So first of all, thank you for your question. Just a brief comment on our meetings that I had this week. So one of the meetings was with the Lawrence Meredith, and we talked actually about the questionnaire about the future. Is it possible for Ukraine actually to get this fast track? As you know, Ukraine has already filled in and submitted the first part of the questionnaire, and Commission is now working on it. We got the answers that Commission will submit to the European Council in June, their report on the questionnaire and our answers, and then the decision will be made on whether it is possible to have some kind of fast track or it is not possible, what should be done further with Ukraine, and so on. But talking about the patience, whether Ukrainians have some strategic patience, since 1991, Ukrainians have been, on their way to the European Union. There were some moments, some crucial moments, which influenced the agenda. 2004, 2014, 2022, and there were many other events which actually impacted the history of Ukraine and the aim, the road, but which maybe many of you are not aware of. But through these years, 30 years of independence, Ukrainians have been, step by step, going towards the European Union. So I cannot answer your question like, yes, Ukraine will be ready to wait for 5-10 more years, because I'm only the one person. I cannot speak for the whole country. But what I can say is that Ukrainians have shown great enthusiasm in joining the European Union, in protecting the European Union borders and protecting our shared values. But still, in order for them to keep fighting as strong as they are doing, there should be some incentives from the EU side. And these incentives should be discussed really carefully, and they should be visible. Ukrainians should understand that they're not fighting just alone, that they have the support and they are backed up by the European Union, at least with this possibility of fast track.
So if I may just add on that 2 points. Number one, reconstruction. I mean, something the EU can really do, even as a soft, green, civilian superpower, is a massive contribution to reconstruction. Point number one. Point number two, as many of you will know, there's a very interesting conversation now around ideas of a staged accession. There's a paper by the Center for European Policy Studies here in Brussels, which actually was thinking about the Western Balkans, so that you become part of parts of the European Union before you become a full member. And I think that addresses, or helps to address, the issue. Who else would like to come in? Anna, over there. Could you just check the mic is working? Because I said it was, but
I think it is.
You think it is?
I'll check it.
I think the mic is for online
Yes.
All right.
speakers, so they can hear
All
the
right.
question.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for that impressive statement. To go back to what you were saying earlier, and especially to Jan's point, reminding us all that there has been war in Europe in these last 70 years, I'd like to comment on the fact that we do have this perception that there hasn't been. And another war that, as has also been mentioned, that has been going on is the war in Ukraine for many years, as Sophie pointed out. So my question, I'm afraid it's one of those annoying what-if questions. If Ukraine had not had the amazing reaction that impressed all of us, inspired all of us in defending its country, if Zelensky hadn't inspired also both Ukrainians and the world with your resistance, do you think Russia would just roll over Ukraine and Europe would just have pretty much the same reaction it did in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea?
That's a tough question, Liliia.
Great question. So thank you for that question.
Yeah. Why I'm asking this is because it was a shock to me, perhaps because I was studying politics. I was just starting to study politics when that happened. And I was a bit shocked that we just witnessed that and barely had a reaction. There was some discussion about real sanctions, significant sanctions, and we just forgot about it. And there has been a war going on. So that's why I'm asking this. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. So I will start with questioning a bit what Jan said. Sorry, I didn't want to interfere with it, but you mentioned that European Union was so fast, like in 4 days they adopted the package of sanctions against Russia when the war started, and it took them 4 years to adopt the package after the crisis and 4 months after something else, sorry, can't recall what, but it took the European Union at least 8 years to adopt the package of sanctions against Russia. It took it not 4 days, it was more than 8 years of ongoing war in Ukraine. So as Ukrainian, I am extremely grateful to the European Union and EU citizens for acting this time so fast. But it was not fast from the historical perspective. And I'm glad that there was no if. You mentioned if, let us imagine if. I am glad that there was no if. And that Ukrainians and Ukrainian presidents stand for the country, and then European Union joined. So my answer will be like that.
Yeah, it's worth noting Nord Stream 2 started after 2014, and increasingly it looks to us as if 2014 was the turning point at which the EU failed to turn. I think that's right. Jan, did you want to come back?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to respond. So just for the record, it wasn't me who said it, was Alexander Stubb, and there are a lot of problems with this proposition he made, that's for sure. And yeah, I think that you mentioned a very important aspect that often here in the European Union, there is a big misconception about it, that we start perceiving that the war in Ukraine started roughly in February, whereas it's not the case, and it's been going for years. So that's one of those misconceptions. And well, Anna also asked a very relevant question, what if question, yes? And then obviously we've been all amazed by the heroic struggle of Ukrainian people. And I guess that partial response to this overt European support now for Ukraine is related to demystifying certain myths that were very, very harmful to Ukraine, where there was this perception in Europe that Ukraine is this post-1991 post-Soviet state with a deeply fragmented national identity. And actually the famous question was, what actually a Russian-speaking citizen of Kharkiv has in common with Ukrainian-speaking citizen from Lviv? And that was the argument about this fragmented identity. Well, clearly the Ukrainians struggle now, and the fact that the Russian-speaking citizen of Kharkiv is fighting arm to arm with a Ukrainian-speaking citizen in Lviv is showing that this is a strong and united nation in face of a common threat.
Yeah, and if I may add, I think the other myth that was rapidly demystified by the Ukrainians after the 24th of February in particular is the myth of irresistible mighty Russia, which was a very widespread feeling in much of Western Europe, in Germany, but not just in Germany, that it was obvious the Russians were just going to roll over, and didn't happen. We've only got, I'm afraid, a few more minutes, so if you want to come in and ask a question from this amazing, yes, please, yes. If you just take the mic for the people online.
Thanks.
If you could just kindly just identify yourself.
Right, thank you. I'm also Ukrainian. I'm a student at the Institute of International Relations in Ukraine, in Kyiv. So actually, I was wondering whether, like, we've already mentioned Nord Stream 2, And actually, it was started after the invasion to Crimea and to eastern Ukraine. So we see that response was not actually right after the annexation of Crimea. So my question is whether the results of today's sanctions are going to last. Because we all know how the world forgot about everything that happened in 2014. So is it a turning point for Europe to understand who is their partners and who is their rivals? And are these results going to last?
That's a
Thank
great
you.
question. Let's collect a last round of questions. I might add on one or two of my own. Would anyone else like to come in? Don't hold back. Anyone at the back there, would you like to come in? Any question? Yes, the gentleman right at the back.
My name is Hannes Koch. I was born and raised in Eastern Germany. And so for me, this debate today on the May 8th is very important because for us in Germany, of course, it's the day of deliberation. Like the historic speech of our former president, von Weizsäcker. And so my question refers to the role of Germany in this whole context, Ukraine, since 2014, especially when it comes to energy. Resources and energy security. And I think we in Germany, we played a very questionable role in this whole context here, historically seen and also now, I think. And of course, we have a big and fundamental responsibility as such a big nation, not to support you economically, but also, to support you with our full, power, not only political meaning, but also in a sense of values. And I think in history we have sold our values for cheap energy. Yeah, this is my position to that. And now we pay a very, very bloody price. Yeah, and we have to rethink that as Germany. Yeah. So.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. I mean, I would add to that that Germany is an extreme example of a challenge actually the whole West faces. If your business model is built on getting cheap energy from Russia, selling cars to China, and weapons to the Middle East, your business model conflicts with your values and actually your long-term strategic interests. So what are we going to do about that? So we have sanctions, will they hold, which is connected to the point I just made. We have the role of Germany. I want to add on, to come back to democracy, to you, Sophie, in your last minute concluding remarks. Just tell us a bit about what you think is coming out of the Conference on the Future of Europe, having been so critical about it in our report. So let's go in reverse order, starting with you, Liliia. Just a couple of minutes, if you could.
So talking about sanctions, as I'm Ukrainian, indeed, I hope that this time sanctions will be, let's call them a real one. So that we will not have the situation when we are paying billions of euros to Russia for gas and oil, and we are just sending helmets to Ukrainian soldiers. Regarding the role of Germany, indeed, in Ukraine, approach to Germany is quite critical because Ukrainians do understand that Germany has such a tight, ties with Russia that it might be difficult for German politicians to simply understand what is going on without thinking only about money and only about this financial aspect. But all Ukrainians, I believe that all Ukrainians are extremely grateful to those German people who are participating in the demonstrations, who are actually forcing the government to make steps, to take some actions. Because thanks to them, Germany is acting. Germany is now, providing a real support. But that's thanks to the Europeans and thanks to the German people. So thank you for being here and for your support.
Right.
But as I'm Ukrainian, I'll pass the floor next.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
when it comes to the issue of Nord Stream 2, as a Polish citizen, it's a very sensitive issue. I mean, say what you want about Law and Justice government and its policy, but the Polish government was very vocal about the threats of Nord Stream 2, and for years they've been calling and raising our attention towards this problem of bypassing Central Eastern Europe between Germany and Russia. And there was a very important question: how long this sentiment, how long this German sentiment to support Ukraine rather than to follow its corrupted business model will continue. Well, we need to remember that the presence of Russian capital in Germany is rather a significant one. There are a lot of economic connections, a lot of companies which benefit from this cooperation. And the issue of interconnectedness is still a force. So I guess that we all need to continue exerting this pressure, because it's the only tangible solution that can lead to some change in German economic thinking.
Thank you very much, Jan. I think, in fairness, it's important to add what Liliia also said. It's an extremely lively debate in Germany itself. A lot of Germans are themselves making this case, and very influential German voices, left, right, and center, are making this case. So I think that also has to be said. Sophie.
Yeah, on a conference on the future of Europe, there has been now a set of 49 proposals just published a couple of days ago. Some of them are actionable right now. Some of them require some new regulations. Some of them require treaty changes. So we have a range of possibilities. Some could be done right now. Some are very difficult to implement. What I have seen so far is that a lot of them are not particularly groundbreaking. A lot of them have been said before. A lot of them have been part of the debates we have been having. So there's not anything really groundbreaking. But I see some positive out of it because, for instance, this idea of having transnational lists for the European Parliament is something that was pushed in the Conference on the Future of Europe, and now there has been a proposal approved by the European Parliament about this specifically. So there is a little bit of continuity. Then when it comes to treaty change, of course, so far, most member states have been extremely reluctant to open the Pandora box of treaty change. But I feel like if it comes from the Conference on the Future of Europe, there is that push because it comes from public opinion and from the public itself, which is something that then could push for political will to open that Pandora's box. It would be impossible to open that box without the public's first interest into doing these treaty changes. So I do see a lot of positive development, but it will be necessary to follow up on the proposals and to make them actually be implemented, because otherwise we will just forget about that document within a few weeks.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So please feel free to mix and mingle here. And if any of you have not recorded an interview for our website, it's just 5 or 6 simple questions. Do you identify as a European? What was your formative European moment? What do you think was the best and worst moment in European history? The one big thing you'd like the EU to do by 2030. Do please seize the opportunity. There's a wonderful booth just over there. There's someone to help you. It'll take just 5 minutes, and we'd love to have your voice, all of you, on the website, where you will be immortalized forevermore on the website. So, the final session of this series starts at 3 o'clock. It's a round table with all 6 of us and a moderator, so do hang about for that if you can. But meanwhile, this has been a terrific panel, and please join me in thanking our speakers.